Hey there, folks. Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the number one Loma Prida fan, the band, not the earthquake, here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Frail Body record, Artificial Bouquet. In 2019, Frail Body released the record A Brief Memoriam, their first full-length studio album. The record lived up to its name, barely cracking 20 minutes and still managing to endure as one of the most creatively distinct and powerful screamo records of the past handful of years for the genre, arguably a defining record for modern-day screamo as a subgenre or movement or whatever you would really want to consider it. The themes of grieving, death, and acceptance surrounding that record allowed it to be one of the most earnest and genuine sounding quote-unquote extreme music records of its given year, and arguably the entire 2010s decade, really capping off the history of screamo for the 2010s quite nicely, as it is arguably the last major release that the genre saw throughout that decade before, well, the 2020s happened, and, well, there's just been a lot of stuff going on this decade so far. It's been kind of hard to keep up since then. In all seriousness, though, that is a record that presents ideas of darkness and hopelessness in the face of grief that are so genuine, so heartbreaking, and so striking that it really does feel like an emotional journey and a major achievement in terms of presenting one's own negative feelings honestly in music. And despite the fact that it is, again, only a couple minutes over 20, it feels like a major listen. It feels like something you really have to sit down and experience for yourself. And now here we are in 2024, 5 years after the aforementioned A Brief Memoriam, and we have Frail Body's sophomore studio album, Artificial Bouquet. I've heard some people say bouquet and other people say bouquet, so I'm just going with what sounds right to me, alright? Artificial Bouquet, Frail Body's second full-length studio album, allows them to expand upon their sound thanks to a lengthier runtime, thus giving the listener more material to sink their teeth into, also seeing Frail Body create an atmosphere that is, in its best moments, genuinely beautiful. Artificial Bouquet feels like Frail Body at their very best, or at least the best we've ever seen from them up to this point on all fronts musically. There are so many small details here that really do add up into a greater picture, a lot of very minute moments that are nonetheless proof of how passionately detailed a lot of different passages throughout this record are. Even a few passages that are only a couple seconds can have specific moments that really do stand out and just add upon each other until you get a record that is so much more heavily detailed and worth consistently revisiting than one might actually expect. The various moments where Lowell Schaffer's guitar work kind of slows down and focuses less on being an atmospheric tool for a brief moment or so as it becomes more melodic and the center of the record's attention in those moments, it feels absolutely stunning. There's a lot of tension being built in those moments, especially as he progressively works back up into his more natural screams that you hear throughout a lot of the record. I feel like those passages in particular really do add a sense of emotional intensity as things are kind of dialed back here for a few moments on various tracks throughout this record before exploding back into the sort of post-metal influences that a lot of this record does take up in regards to the kind of density that it presents sonically. I would actually say the guitar tone here in particular is really important in creating the kind of emotional atmosphere that you do get here, as tracks like Horizon Line, for example, have this sort of oddly warm guitar tone that I think surprisingly suits the record extremely well. It's this melancholic warmth that pairs nicely with the overall emotional and at times deeply hurt material that you can get throughout this record, and I think as a whole, this sort of almost nostalgia that you get in a lot of the guitar work, especially in, like I mentioned before, those dialed back moments, it makes for something that at times can feel really special. I also do want to clarify that Schaffer does honestly feel like much more here than just a pretty intense front person who manages to suit Frail Body's overall style. I mean, that may actually be true in the most literal sense, but I really do feel like a good portion of this record is Lowell Schaffer almost coming across as possessed by this deeply wounded being that's able to just expel a lot of these extremely negative and hurt feelings out into the open freely in a way that is horrifically beautiful in a way that you almost don't want to find a lot of the vocal performances here beautiful. There's a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, but it feels so raw and it feels so human, and it's easy to connect with this record and with Schaeffer's vocal performances because of that. The bass tone that you hear throughout the majority of this record is tight and punchy as well, though I also do think that Nicholas Clemenson's drum work here should not go underestimated or underappreciated either. There are a lot of performances here that he provides on tracks like Critique Program and Runaway that feel downright explosive and provides this degree of chaos that I think the record really does need, even though it already is inherently a very apocalyptic sounding record in the first place. I really just do feel like he adds that extra degree of weight behind the record that really makes this in a way, though I can kind of say that about a lot of qualities of this record. It really does feel like everything here is absolutely essential, and I think a great example of that is that aforementioned song Runaway, where you get those explosive drums, that punchy bass tone, and Schaeffer absolutely belting out some of the most striking lyrics on the record with the lines, "And if my memory loses every day, then how else can we speak?" which ends up just being such a moving moment. And even though it isn't a moment that's highlighted or particularly emphasized within the context of the record, it really does manage to stand out as a single track off of a record that doesn't really feel like the kind of album you can cherry pick from, as a moment that really does stand out as an example of what Frail Body are capable of delivering instrumentally, musically, and most importantly, emotionally. From the entirely instrumental standpoint alone, this is Frail Body at the best that we've ever really seen them, or at least I would say so. I really do think that Artificial Bouquet is an example of a band that is pouring every ounce of their souls into their performances here, whether it's the massive wall of sound moments, which are very nicely provided by producer Pete Grossman, I would like to clarify, or the most stripped back melodic moments alike. I really do feel like every single second here has, for the most part, a degree of unrelenting humanity being put into it, and it definitely does make it all the more striking of a record. And it's because of that that I feel this record can be considered very mournful but very cathartic at the same time. I mean, this is a very depressing album, as it rightfully should be considered by anyone listening to it. It's a record that is heavily structured around ideas of grief and regret, yet at the same time, it really does feel like there is this massive acknowledgement of negative emotion here. Not necessarily a release per se, but more so an acknowledgement and a conveying of those emotions, as if those feelings are still going to stick around, they aren't going anywhere even after this record is over, but they are at the very least acknowledged and not just sort of kicked under the rug or anything like that. And because of that, I really do think that there are some powerful performances on here. At the end of the day, however, I would say that Artificial Bouquet is a record that is not about the instrumentation itself whatsoever, or at least not the composition of the actual instrumentation. I mean, I like looking at that kind of thing as much as the next nerd, but I don't necessarily think that you need to look into something like that on this record to really appreciate the great qualities of it. This isn't a Symphony X record or anything like that. You don't have to know music theory to appreciate this album, obviously. I think that the impassioned performances on display here are what define this record's own high standards, because this album isn't necessarily about the impactful qualities of the bass, or the really nice lush guitar tone you get here, or the pounding drum work that you get here. I think anything related to that doesn't really feel necessarily important in appreciating this record and what it manages to achieve, because truly it feels like this record is based heavily around atmosphere. And more importantly, I do think that the success of this record and the emotional depth of this record is based around atmosphere. It's the atmosphere found in tracks like Devotion, or even single moments like the final brooding moments of the album closer, A Capsule in the Sediment, that truly make for a really gripping listening experience in my eyes. I really think that it's the depth of the sound here, with some, again, amazing production going on, with a lot of wall of sound density, the emotional depth that you can very clearly hear being poured into it by the members of Frail Body. It's just a degree of passion, a degree of detail, a degree of depth going into this record that really does make it feel like it's something much more visceral than it has any right to be. And that's not necessarily to say I wasn't expecting a great record from Frail Body. Their past work has been great, and I was hoping for more of the same. But I really do think that this album is something that manages to encapsulate the atmospherics of a lot of post-metal, including some more black metal kind of influences going on here, sort of black gaze, sort of shoegaze influences going on here than I personally would have ever really expected. I mean, they've always been a pretty atmospheric band, just not necessarily in the way that I would say they are on here. Now, it is very reasonable to say that the entire record kind of bleeds together to some extent, and that will understandably turn some people away, specifically some people who are looking for records that they can pick some favorite songs from, that they can, cherry pick a few tracks from, and enjoy those songs more than the rest of the record without feeling like there's this overlap that leaves tracks feeling incomplete when you take them out of the context of the record. And admittedly, that does make some of the material here hard to revisit because of that, because there are just some times where you may not be in the mood for a full Frail Body album, a full 40 minutes of a Frail Body album. But at that, I really don't think that being able to revisit this is the point or anything like that. In fact, even though this is one of the best records I've heard all year so far, I really don't think I'll be revisiting it a ton, because it's more of an emotional experience above all else. The replayability isn't a factor in discussion here. I mean, if that's something that you want to discuss about this record, go for it, but I don't necessarily think that's something important to really bring up in the context of this kind of record. And I do completely understand why some people may argue that as a flaw, that a lot of the individual tracks here don't sound nearly as good when they are taken out of their placement in the track list. But to that, I say, why are you doing that? That's obviously not how it was intended to be heard. I think the choice to make Artificial Bouquet a record that is necessary to listen to front to back is a really great one on behalf of Frail Body, because it allows them to convey a lot of the pain and suffering of this record in a way that is earnest, in a way that is genuine, and most importantly, in a way that doesn't have to feel confined in a manner to pander towards audiences that may want a more easily accessible album. And that's not necessarily me trying to be pretentious and say, oh, this is just an inaccessible album, you probably wouldn't get it. But at the same time, I do feel like this might be an inaccessible album for some, at least for individuals who aren't heavily familiarized with the realms of screamo and some of the more black gaze, shoegaze adjacent genres that are going on here in terms of the more secondary influences. So as a whole, I think what you have here is a record that should be listened to start to finish each time, not only because a lot of the tracks here sound kind of awkward out of context, but also because this is the kind of album that I think really can pull you in a way that isn't heavily shown in a lot of the individual tracks on their own, and I just don't get why you wouldn't want to hear this from beginning to end. I mean, I don't want to hear it constantly because this is an emotionally brutal album, but still, when I do want to hear it, it's a pretty excellent listen. And again, like I said earlier in the review, it's a lot of the smaller details here that really do make the album, whether you really find yourself enamored with the immediacy of the opening track scaffolding and how it just straight away kicks into everything, not wasting any time for atmospherics and allowing that to develop over the course of the rest of the record instead, or you enjoy some of the studio trickery on the track Monolith with its opening riff and how it constantly bounces between channels until finally rebooting itself and coming in full force. It's all of these moments that really do make this a unique listening experience, and the fact that there is obviously so much love and so much passion and so much emotional turmoil that is genuine going into this record, it just makes it feel, I've said it before, but I'll say it again, it makes it feel like a deeply human and a deeply honest album. Artificial Bouquet may be Frail Body at their absolute best, but at the same time, I don't necessarily know if they care what their quote-unquote best should be or what it should sound like, because above all else, this sounds like a band putting out pure emotional release before anything, and said release just so happens to be made and produced and created by a trio of extremely talented musicians. And like I said before, this doesn't necessarily feel like the expelling of negative emotions, but it also doesn't feel like the nihilistic embrace of negativity either. Rather, it just really does feel like the acknowledgement of pain and the acknowledgement of suffering and regret and one's own mistakes and difficult situations that are hard to genuinely put into words unless it's a particularly powerful record like this. But at the end of the day, it also feels like an album that is maybe trying to move on to some degree. Not necessarily that the album does allow the listener to move on if you are to put yourself into the perspective of the narrator throughout this record, but that at the very least by the end of the album you get some semblance that while things are very difficult and very painful in the present moment, that maybe things will change in the future and that things maybe will get at least slightly better, or you'll at least be able to find some sense of peace in whatever is going on in your life. And it ends up being a pretty powerful finale, even if it is one that I don't find myself, again, returning to a ton in the future, most likely just because of the fact that it's rough, to say the least, but I think that kind of goes without saying. When Lowell Schaffer delivers the final lines of the record, "I'll get you to the lake someday, a sediment bed you'll rest," all you can do is kind of take in what remains of a record that feels frayed, it feels devastating, and otherwise broken in a way that manages to be heartachingly beautiful in its best moments and atmospheric throughout the entire record in a way that many bands can only ever really hope to achieve. I do also want to clarify that the guy that mastered this record, Jack Shirley, has worked with bands like Loma Prida and Death Heaven in the past, so I feel like that kind of explains a lot here, and I didn't really know where to fit that in the review, so I'm just tacking it on to the end here, but I just think that's kind of interesting. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.